My stepmother believed she had finally won 5 years of no contact when her father passed away. Dad was always 3 steps ahead of the spectators. But all of a sudden, I wasn't family enough to go to the will reading. When I put the property deeds on the table, Diana's expression was priceless. This meeting is exclusively for heirs before I get into this crazy situation. The lawyer stated. I grinned and spread the documents I already had. If you like family drama and sweet retribution, please let me know where you're watching this inheritance. Story in the comment section. For more amazing true stories, click the like button and subscribe. Now let's talk about how I reversed my on a soggy Tuesday morning in Singapore. I was in the middle of a call from the greedy stepfamily when my phone displayed a number I hadn't seen in years, that of a childhood friend. I was in the middle of closing a significant development transaction when Grace broke the news that would alter everything. Her voice faltered. Maxwell, your father died last. It had been 5 years since I had spent the night in Maplewood, 5 years after my father, and I had an explosive dispute that had me packing my bags and leaving the small town where I grew up. I was returning after taking an aircraft to Asia with the intention of establishing my own reputation in the global real estate development industry. As the cab arrived, I felt like a heartbroken stranger rather than the wayward son. A flood of recollections swept me back to the expansive Victorian home where I had spent my early years. The basketball dad taught me how to shoot the hoop, and we spent long summer evenings discussing business plans. When I was 10 years old, the garden where we buried my mother appeared smaller in some way, the size of Diana's silver Mercedes sitting in the driveway with 2 other opulent cars was exaggerated in my memory. Automobiles I was unfamiliar with. My father has always favored his vintage Cadillac. Like him, I was straightforward, trustworthy, and modest. I paid the driver and stood up before I could reach for the bottom of the stairs. My suitcase felt heavier than it had at the airport. The front door opened as the doorbell rang, and my stepsister Brittany was standing there. Her face, Maxwell, she replied in a flat voice, behind a carefully constructed mask of solemn politeness that prevented her eyes from meeting it. We're in. Certain you'd arrive. He was my father, I said plainly, and she moved aside to let me entry. I went into the entryway of the house, which no longer felt like home, had been redecorated in all chrome. Diana's favorite ultra-modern design, bright glass, and uncomfortably shaped furniture. There was no indication of Dad's love of cozy woods. And old Brittany told me that the Leather Moms were in the living room with Tyler and a few friends. Leading the way without offering to Diana was holding court among a group while sitting on a white leather sofa. Take my purse. When she noticed me, her flawlessly painted face reminded me of some of the town's residents. Exhibited shock before swiftly shifting into the face of a heartbroken widow. Maxwell added. Taking off and kissing my cheek. What a surprise. Of course, we tried to get in touch with you. However, your phone number has changed. I formally apologized for your loss. Understanding the dance we were going to do. My stepbrother Tyler interrupted, not understanding that the funeral was tomorrow. At 2, he's stretched out in an armchair, and we've made all the arrangements without consulting him. I received a clear indication that I wasn't wanted or required here. And your previous room as being Diana has since added it to the storage area, but we can prepare the guest room for... You nodded abruptly, eager to get away from the unpleasant steps. I believe I'll settle in. Then as I started to go, Diana called out to me in a honey-like voice. The estate issues are being handled by Poison under Harold Stevenson, who will be only you understand that I'm here in the morning to talk about some paperwork. Family, I completely realized that I was being specifically left out of the will, and later, when I sat on looking at the old oak tree on the back porch, where my father and I had constructed a treehouse when I was 8 years old. They've been terrible, Max, she murmured as she sat next to me. Ever since Richard became ill, Diana has been meeting with developers to discuss selling off houses, acting as though they already own the town. According to her, Grace had stayed in Maplewood to manage her family's hardware store. After growing up next door, Diana had never bothered to tell me that her father's health had progressively deteriorated over the past year. Your dad kept your international magazine features in his files, Grace added gently, and asked about you all the time. Office was Grace, and the knot in my breast grew tighter. His office is still standing, corrected Diana. Everything was packaged up and relocated last week after she cleared it out. I thanked Grace for stopping by, and she replaced the locks on the storage. I went back inside, my thoughts racing, and the guest room was just what I had anticipated. As I unpacked, I felt cold and impersonal, with none of my past or possessions. Heard voices coming from the corridor. After Harold gives his approval, we can proceed with the Riverside property tomorrow. What about Maxwell? Sale Diana mentioned that Lawrence had already made an offer. Tyler inquired if he thought he would cause trouble, and Diana laughed sharply. What can he do? When Richard abandoned his father, Maxwell made his decision and left everything to us. I sat on the side of the bed and thought about Dad, and I had our disagreements but abandoned each other, and my hands were shaking with anguish and rage. After I contacted for months after leaving, Diana informed me that he was either too busy or uninterested in talking to me. I finally gave up that night, and since I couldn't sleep, I toured the house Eni brought down my favorite book, The Count of Monte Cristo, Dad. From a library where I discovered several of my old books remaining on the shelves, Dot had presented it to me on my 16th birthday. Writing Maxwell's words, remember that perseverance and preparation always pay off. As I turned the yellowed pages, an envelope fell out and dropped to the ground, revealing a letter written in my father's characteristic style that was written only 3 months prior. If you're reading this, Maxwell, I'm probably gone. Diana. Isn't aware of this letter or the plans I've made. The key to the safety deposit box located at First National Box number 247 is whatever you may think of me. You should know that I always had a taped back of the Monte Cristo artwork at my office. Plan. Dad. With my heart racing, I walked to Dad's office, but the door was locked as Grace mentioned, but I also recalled the hallway's loose floorboard, where Dad stored an extra key and other items. The room had been stripped barren, with no books or papers, and nothing had changed. Personal belongings. But I gently took down the painting that was still hanging on the wall. I decided to go to the bank, and Harold, after discovering the little key exactly where my father had indicated it, would be tomorrow. It was time to discover the precise plans my father had been making while I was growing up as Richard and Stevenson's office. Before I could ride a bike, Harrison's son taught me about real estate. Some fathers taught their children to toss-eye, learned how to determine property values, and identify a poor foundation from 100 yards away thanks to baseballs. For 3 years, it was just my dad and I against the world when my mother passed away from cancer when I was 10. He was preparing me to eventually take over Harrison Properties, and I was learning everything I could until Diana Winters arrived. She brought beauty, charm, and a real concern into our lives. When they got married, I was 13 years old enough to be cautious, but still young enough to hope for a new family. Diana's last marriage produced 2 children, Tyler, who was my age, and Brittany, who was for a while, when she was 2 years younger. Everything were all right. Not fantastic, but all right, and Diana made that content, and it was what I cared about. But gradually, things started to shift. My weekend property visits with Dad were rescheduled to accommodate the dinner table being farther away. During Brittany's dance recital or Tyler's soccer matches, Diana began to redecorate the U. Must give them a chance because the house is erasing my mother's traces room by room. Every time I grumbled, Maxwell Dad would answer, "They're family now." By the time I was 16, I had essentially been ignored at home while Diana took on the role of Dad's employee confidant. Going with him to networking events and meetings that I used to go to, Tyler abruptly developed an interest in real estate, and in spite of this, Dad and I were overjoyed. Kept up our relationship through Harrison Properties, Dad's life's work, a business that owned and oversaw around 30% of Maplewoods and the neighboring area's commercial real estate, which had begun as a single. When my parents first got married, they bought an apartment building that had developed into a multi-million-dollar enterprise. Maxwell Dad used to say, "Money comes and goes, but land and buildings are permanent." I took those phrases to heart when I was studying business, since they are real and durable. In real estate during my undergraduate years. I gained knowledge of every facet of the industry, spending summers at Harrison Properties. I was prepared to assume a leadership position by the time I finished, having transitioned from maintenance to management to development. Dad had been preparing a large-scale, mixed-use riverside project that would revive the area, but everything fell apart. Had worked on the plans for Maplewoods downtown for months, but when I got back from a trip looking into similar events in other cities, I found that important changes had occurred without my involvement, and Diana and I believed that a more expensive strategy would produce greater results, Dad clarified. When I questioned him, "The luxury condos will sell better than the mixed income homes you suggested," which wasn't the goal we discussed. "Diana," he replied, "something that would benefit the entire town, not just the wealthy. Sometimes you have to be practical." Possesses great intuition for these things. The dispute intensified, and 5 years of bitterness spilled forth as I accused him of eschewing our common principles for Diana's materialistic worldview, and picking his new family over me. Claimed that I was rigid and idealistic, saying that perhaps I wasn't prepared for this degree of responsibility. Said that the last straw for me was that maybe you should wait to join the corporate leadership until you're more mature. A college acquaintance had given me a job in Singapore, so I packed my bags that evening and boarded a trip there. Developing company. I promised to demonstrate that I could be successful on my own terms, and I succeeded. Over the following 5 years, I established a reputation in Southeast Asia for creative, community-focused development projects. Asia, international business. Magazines published my work, and I received awards for sustainable. I made more money than I could spend on design. But my father and I didn't reconcile, and the number of monthly calls decreased. Then nothing, so I told myself he knew how to get in touch with me if, according to Grace, who informed me when I returned, he wanted to. But the morning following my arrival in Maplewood, Diana had thwarted his attempts, so I went straight to First National Bank. When the safety deposit box opened, it had a folder of legal paperwork and property deeds, just what I had hoped for, and a USB drive, which held a video file dated 6. I located a quiet coffee shop and plugged into my laptop. Dad didn't look like the strong man I remembered Maxwell when he was on screen months before. He looked pale and slender. Started, "If you're viewing this, you've discovered my letter, and I'm leaving first. I must apologize, since my biggest regret is letting Diana get in the way of our relationship. However, I wanted to let you know that I never stopped making plans for your future." He clarified that for the previous 3 years, he had been silently giving me direct ownership of important Harrison property assets, including the Riverside development lands, the apartment buildings on Maple Street, and the downtown business block. Had all been legitimately transferred to me via a number of transfers and trusts intended to reduce the tax consequences. "Diana doesn't know," he went on. "I discovered after your dispute that she had more control over me than I perceived to be. Healthy. I couldn't allow her to set Tyler up to take over in spite of his inexperience and lack of sincere enthusiasm. My father had wasted everything I had created and everything I desired for you. Given the short time he had, he was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer 2 years ago. Organized his affairs in collaboration with Franklin Ross, his longtime friend and business associate, to make sure his legacy would. Dad emphasized in the video that reading will be challenging, so be careful. Believes she will be in charge of everything. Therefore, the official will leave her the house and a few accounts that will sustain her lifestyle. That you already own the majority of the company's assets. Franklin has all the information. The video concluded with, "I am proud of what you've done, son," and I'm looking right into the camera. "Come home and finish what we began together." I sat in awe, tears running down my cheeks as Dad had been watching out for me and our safety when the screen went dark. After gathering my thoughts, I called Franklin Ross, since we had a common vision and I hadn't supported him when he needed me most. And made plans to meet him at his workplace. My father had been friends with the stern older man since college, and they had always, when I came, he gave me a naked hug as a sign of his kindness. Franklin verified everything in the statement. Your dad was worried you wouldn't come back even after he was gone. The most important Harrison holdings were lawfully given to me by the video dad through a number of employees. That it is entirely permissible to give some as gifts and sell others at low prices, and bound Diana will be upset, Franklin said, adding that she has been planning. She is already negotiating the sale of the Riverside property with Lawrence Blackwood based on her authority over those assets. Dad's longtime business competitor, Lawrence Blackwood, was a developer renowned for his shoddy, pricey houses. My blood boiled at the notion of his hands touching my father's meticulously put together portfolio. What about the will reading? Franklin's face darkened as he was asked. Harold Stevenson has been Diana's puppet. To prevent suspicion, your dad kept him on as the family lawyer for years, but he didn't trust him with the true plan. Diana has made it clear that you are not welcome, and Harold has planned the reading for this afternoon. I fingered the Franklin's property deeds in my briefcase. Oh, I suppose I'll go anyhow. Richard, who often said that you had his flair for the dramatic moment, as I was leaving, would have liked this. His smile was WOFISH. My father had entrusted me with his office, and I felt his presence more strongly than I had since coming back to Maplewood. Diana and her kids were going to discover that they had undervalued both his legacy and my commitment to upholding it for 20 years. Harrison Men's Margaret Wilson served as my father's executive assistant. When I entered Harrison Properties, she was well versed with the company's history and everyone in Maplewood. Maxwell Harrison, she began as she got up from her desk at headquarters that morning, her face beaming with real delight. I was hoping you'd come, she said, embracing me. The offices had changed, becoming sleeker and colder. Margaret's realm was still a cozy throwback with its neat design, but Diana's influence was still noticeable in the furnishings. File drawers and family pictures, which I found painfully obvious, and a number of your father wanted me to give you this, Margaret said. Of me that your father must have kept her stocked with over the years. He discreetly gave me a second USB drive and made me swear to give it to you in person rather than mailing or leaving it. Thanked her and inquired about the company's present situation, and Margaret's expression changed since Diana took over operations. Troubled things have changed, including staff cost-cutting initiatives. She demoted Tyler and brought in consultants who had no idea how your father operated the company. Despite having a vice president position, voice Tyler hardly ever appears, and when he does, he makes choices that reverse years of meticulous labor. I inquired about particular carefully avoiding disclosing information that I already knew from the documentation and my conversation with Franklin. about projects and properties. Margaret's responses supported my assumptions that Diana had been methodically getting ready to destroy my father's Riverside property has undergone a thorough overhaul. According to Margaret, who said it was a skillfully constructed empire for short-term gains. Luxury condos and upscale real estate have taken the place of your father's idea for a community area with reasonably priced housing. Store. Next month, construction will be taken over by Lawrence Blackwood's company. I asked to see my father's office before I left, but Margaret hesitated. Diana claimed she required the place for the new marketing staff, so it was emptied out last week, but I would still like to view it. Space had previously been occupied by my father's books. Maps, an assortment of local historical, it was now a vacant shell, and as I stood there, I had a fresh feeling off her pose. I discovered a way to fulfill my father's vision for Maplewood, which went beyond simply claiming my fortune. Viewing the contents of a second USB drive in a peaceful area in a nearby park. This one included additional videos of my father. He had taken notes while touring different estates, describing their significance and his aspirations for their future. These personal notes from the final year of his life formed a thorough blueprint for his idea of the Riverside. In one recording, he stated, "The project is the most important." While standing on the abandoned beachfront property that had been our final point of contention was that this could transform Maplewood, create housing and chances for everyone, not just the rich. Diana is unaware that a community need. Economic Variety Toy have given you this property because I know you'll take good care of it. He appeared worn out, but resolute in another video as he sat in his office. I've been observing your work in Asia, including the mixed-use project in Vietnam and the sustainable housing construction in Malaysia. You've improved on what I taught you, and you were correct about where we need to have gone. I was tuned out by the time I was done. I was readily influenced by Diana's emphasis on wealth and prestige. After watching every film, I fully comprehended not just what my father had taught me, but also the reasons behind it. Shielded his most important initiatives from Diana's influence, guaranteeing that they would be produced in accordance with his original idea that we had previously discussed. And my next destination was to meet with the accountant who had managed my father's private money for many years. James Patterson gave me a cordial welcome, but with caution. He said, "I've been expecting you." In his tiny downtown office. James said, "Your father left instructions that I should assist you once you returned." I firmly closed the door behind me. Outlined the intricate financial plans my father had made, including the property transfers he had made. Ownership, but he had also set up Harrison Legacy, a distinct commercial company. The building is quite tasteful, James, and I am the only owner. Outlined for me the flowcharts and balance sheets. Diana thinks, although she is taking over Harrison Properties, the business is now just a shell with no valuable assets. Have undergone a number of completely lawful transactions over the last 3 years to be transferred to Harrison Legacy Holdings. Did Dad abandon Diana without answering any of my questions? I was a little worried, despite James shook his head in agreement, saying that the family home belongs to her. Considerable amounts in investment accounts, from which she will continue to get income from some of the commercial properties. She will not be impoverished by any means, but she will not be in charge of the empire she believed in. I spent the remainder of the morning going over paperwork and calling to confirm my legal status because she was getting at midday. I felt secure in my role because the business's property deeds were legitimate. My father had meticulously made sure that his intentions would be fulfilled no matter what, and the transfers were duly registered. According to his legal will. I felt anxious as I got ready for the will reading at 2 p.m. For years, determined Diana and her kids had worked to remove me from my father's life. believing they had their future because they were unaware of what lay ahead when I dressed with care dot in my briefcase, wearing my finest suit, which is charcoal gray, with a delicate blue tie that my father had given me years ago. I arranged the important documents I could require, including transfer records, business registration documents, and property deeds. Proof of my father's genuine motivations. I gave Grace one final call before leaving for Harold. Stevenson's legal practice had been my closest confidant since I got back, and I appreciated her advice on how to approach the impending encounter. Grace forewarned me that Diana has been telling everyone that you abandoned your father and don't deserve anything. Be ready for theatrics as I play the perfect loving wife character. I'm not seeking to humiliate her. Grace's silence was a powerful statement. I just want to honor Dad's wishes. Okay, I changed, perhaps wanting to give her a little grace-based embarrassment. She chuckled at Max. Your dad missed you and wasn't happy these past few years. He deserves it. Whatever occurs today, keep in mind that he said, come home and take your rightful place. I went to Harold Stevenson's office with more courage, prepared to confront the family that had attempted to remove me from Harold Stevenson's law practice. My father's legacy took up the whole top floor of one of my father actually owned a modest 4-story building in the middle of town. One of the few high-rise structures in Maplewood owned the building, but I questioned whether Harold was aware that I had taken over ownership 6 months prior to my arrival. Took a moment to gather myself in a lobby 5 minutes prior to the set time because this confrontation had been going on for years in the making, even though Diana and her kids were unaware of it. Yet the receptionist appeared shocked when I gave Mr. Harrison as my name. I'll verify with Mr. Stevenson. She vanished down Harold Stevenson. My father's lawyer returned to the corridor a few moments later looking irritated. He wrote my first will when I was 18, and he had managed the documentation when I purchased my first investment property at the age of 21. But suddenly he treated me as though I were a stranger. Even worse than Maxwell the invader, stated without reaching out. This is unexpected. This meeting is merely a modest family get together to talk over preliminary issues. Family. To which I simply replied that Harold was my father's only blood related. Diana sensed that you were uncomfortable and thought it would be best if we could schedule a different meeting to talk about any worries you may have. I'll attend the meeting today. Asked firmly. Shall we? And then, without waiting for an answer, I moved past him in the direction of the Herald, rushed after me, almost tripping in his haste. As I pushed open the conference room where I could hear conversations, Diana sat at the head of the door as the talk inside suddenly stopped. My father would have sat at the table, wearing a sophisticated black outfit that complemented her ash blonde hair. A few other people were there, including Diana's cousin, her father's banker, and Brittany and Tyler, who surrounded her like courtiers. Never liked me and a man I knew as the lawyer for Lawrence Blackwood. Diana echoed first, Maxwell, which surprised me because her tone implied it wasn't a nice one. I came to hear my father's will, I said, sitting down straight. I was unaware of Maxwell, but Harold hesitated uncertainly at the door across from her. Would be joining us. This meeting is for heirs only, Diana remarked icily, her flawlessly manicured features hardening. Maxwell left this family years ago. I just opened my briefcase and took out the item without saying anything, a folder of paperwork. I believe we ought to start, Harold said, sitting down and organizing his papers. Richard Harrison's final will and testament will be read here. Harold started reading the official legal prelude. I looked at the faces seated around the table, and Diana wore a serious expression. Kyler looked dignified as he occasionally dabbed at his dry eyes with a lace handkerchief, bored, and kept looking at his watch, but Brittany was the only one who displayed any real emotion. Harold read, I leave our family with red-rimmed, puffy eyes to my wife, Diana. Contents of the house at 247 Maple Avenue, and the total amount of $2. I saw that million. Diana nodded as though this were exactly what she had anticipated. Didn't appear startled or very appreciative, as this was obviously the bare minimum she expected from my stepdaughter, Brittany. I bequeath you my collection of first edition books and $1 million. Brittany was shocked to see this final section of my father's meticulously curated book collection. I was shocked as well because this didn't fit the ideas my father had told me about decades ago, but I said nothing, awaiting my stepson Tyler. I leave my antique automobile and $1 million, the 1965 collection of Tyler. Smirkdod's cars was worth a lot of money. My business holdings were worth over $100,000, and the Mustang alone was worth that much. Harrison Properties and all associated assets I leave too. Harold went on. With a sparkle of pride in her eye, Diana said, "My son Maxwell Harrison." Room fell silent, and Diana let out a piercing, incredulous laugh. "That's impossible," she answered, "because I was there 2 years ago when Richard changed his will." Harold appeared quite uneasy. A codicil was filed 6 months prior. He acknowledged that it undid the earlier adjustments, and Diana's face reddened with rage. Harold stated weakly, "But you never brought this up, so I didn't know about it until yesterday. It doesn't matter. Richard filed it with the court directly, and I got the formal copy yesterday afternoon." Dismissively, Diana stated that the assets of Harrison Property are what count, and I've been managing the business for the Maxwell's leadership was rejected by the board last year after he gave up his obligations. I finally put the property deeds on the table and slid them in the direction of the deeds to the Riverside development site are located in the downtown area where everyone can see them. Said calmly, "You'll notice that the Maple Street apartments and 12 other important properties are all in the commercial block. My name has been Diana for a while." She grabbed the papers with trembling hands. "These must be forgeries," she said as she went through them, "because they're not legitimately transferred title to me during the previous 3 years, as you can confirm with you mean the properties I already own that I was unable to add to the county recorder's office?" Tyler leaped to his feet to avoid the dramatic flourish that my father would have liked. "You can't just come returning after 5 years," I said evenly. "I'm not taking anything. I'm asserting my right to what is already mine. Dad wanted me to." Have Diana's face had changed his complexion from flush to ashen. "Is it permissible for him to do this?" Harold, who was looking at copies of the deeds with a startled look and grudgingly nodding, if Richard had signed these assets over during his lifetime, they wouldn't be included in the transfers, which seemed to be valid. What about Harrison Properties? Diana insisted on seeing the will. Harold clarified that the company's assets are mostly the buildings that Maxwell acquires, and they are appearing more and more wretched if Maxwell already owns the properties. Then the business is a shell that I completed for him. Further created Harrison Legacy Holdings last year, giving all of these operational control properties to the new entity, of which I am the only owner, and the room became chaotic. Dylan was threatening to sue everyone, including Harold Brittany's seat, and Tyler was yelling about fighting the will. Silently, observing me while wearing an inscrutable look. When Diana eventually ran out of steam, I stated once more in a forceful yet quiet voice, "Your father left you financially comfortable. Diana, the home invested in a few properties that generated revenue, but he wasn't spiteful. But he created Harrison Properties out of nothing and wanted to preserve its history. He was aware that you have no right to sell it off piece by piece." Diana hissed, "I was his wife. Looked after him when you were away in Asia playing developer. I wanted to return, so I called for months. There was a glimmer of shame when you informed me he didn't want to talk to me after I left. He was disappointed in you. So why did it cross Diana's face before she covered it up? Did he abandon me everything? That was important to him? I questioned why he spent thine his latter years. He devised a complex scheme to guarantee that I would continue his job. Brittany spoke for the first time. Did your mother prevent you from speaking to your father before? Diana could. Interrupt, I nodded. Based on his letters and videos, he did attempt to contact. I stroked myself on several videos where Diana's voice raised in fear. Briefcase Dad was meticulous. He recorded all of his choices and the rationale behind them. Expectations for the companies. Future in Maplewood. He was fully aware of your plans, Diana, and the agreement you were making with Lawrence. All of Blackwood's opulent condominiums by the river were cleansed of Harolds. Well, maybe we should call off today. There's a lot to process, and there might be legal issues that need to be addressed. Resolving, I agree, I replied, getting up and collecting my paperwork. My lawyers will be in contact about the property's operational control transition. In the interim, I'd appreciate it if I turned to leave. But Diana pulled me back, her voice laden with more business decisions that are made without my consent. Maxwell, this isn't over with Venom. Your father wasn't acting rationally in the end, and I'll argue with everything. I stopped at the door. You can try, but Dad gave me the truth, Diana. Not just land and a business. The menace lingered in the air as I left, my heart racing, yet my foot was slow. Are you sure you want that made public? I had complied with my father's desires and felt lighter than I had in years. But now came the rebuilding what Diana had attempted to destroy and realizing the vision my father and I had shared was the difficult part. In a small town like ours. Word spread quickly in the morning after the well-reading. Maplewood was a hive of chatter. Quicker than the internet. And by the time I paused for coffee at Bernard's Bakery, I had been given a dozen odd steps and several elderly people who had known my father for decades nodded in congratulations, saying, "Your dad would be mighty." As he gave me a cinnamon roll in the house, Bernard himself expressed his satisfaction, saying Diana had people anxious about what I thanked him, wondering what would happen to the village if she sold everything to foreigners. And sat down by the window to see the well-known beat of Main Street, Maplewood, which had not altered as much as it had, and after 5 years, there is still the same sense of community, the same courthouse at the end of the plaza, and the same stores lining the street. Remained in spite of Diana's best attempts to recreate it in her own image, and she joined me by sliding into the seat across from, "You're the talk of the town," she said, grabbing a slice of my cinnamon roll without my invitation and telling anyone, "Let her try." Who would listen to the fact that you took advantage of your father in his last days and that she will see you in court? In response, Dad recorded everything of his physical and mental health when he made Grace's visage darkened as a result of these arrangements. Be cautious. Diana has Lawrence Blackwood and several powerful allies are upset that I lost the Riverside transaction that I was able to preserve. When Ross arrived and set up a chair without saying, "Morning, kids," he recalled. He stopped. Replying. Grace and I were both in our 30s, but from what I've heard, yesterday was quite a performance. I told him everything, even Diana's threats of legal action. Franklin waved his off-the-charts rhetoric, knowing that her legal standing is weak. What kind of trouble? I questioned the community, and Franklin kindly said, "But that doesn't mean she won't cause trouble." For the past 5 years, Diana has been fostering social capital in this town through business groups, charity boards, and the like. She has persuaded many people that her plan for Maplewood's growth is the best one, offering everything for sale. People are unaware of the fact that Lawrence Blackwood is hardly a vision. I retorted, Grace noted that they only see the glossy depictions of upscale restaurants and shopping by the river. They don't comprehend the implications for housing costs or the town's identity. I spent the remainder of the day attending with important Harrison Properties staff members, informing them of their roles and my goals for the business. The majority appeared to be relieved that Diana's management style had reportedly featured numerous threats of termination, but few who had sided with her and were notably chilly. Margaret had arranged the documents I needed to look at, providing me with a thorough assessment of the business's existing situation, which showed that its cash reserves had been exhausted, and that maintenance, several priceless pieces of land, had been prepped for speedy sales at below-market prices on properties that had been postponed. Rates at which she was defrauding the business of parts, Margaret stated plainly, if youth ramifications were obvious if Diana hadn't returned when you did. A few more months, and she might have irreversible harm to my father's heritage when I came home that night, although I was still residing in the guest room until I found more permanent housing. Diana's house is now legally mine. When our paths crossed, Diana, who had withdrawn to the master suite due to the chilly mood, came out to stare at me. Tyler was overtly hostile, slamming doors and yelling whenever they crossed in the hallway. Threats behind his words, but it was Brittany who startled me by hesitantly knocking on my door after supper. Kenny allowed her in, intrigued about what she wanted, and she asked, appearing uneasy but resolute. I had never been close to Brittany since she had followed her mother's example of keeping me out of family gatherings from the start, but we had never been direct adversaries, she said, clumsily seated on a chair's edge. After a brief pause, she remarked, I wanted to apologize for how things ended with Dad and Richard. I raised, and she acknowledged Tyler, raising an eyebrow at her usage of his name instead of Dad. He was always your dad more than ours. Feigned interest in the company, but it was all a front. All he wanted was the money and the prestige, and Yowis Brittany, who sighed when Mom married Richard, I just wanted a family. Believed that we would all be a single contented group, but she was constantly pushing Tyler and keeping you out of it. Made me uneasy, but I was powerless to stop it. Her confession seemed sincere, that I was still cautious. Why are you revealing everything to me now? Because I discovered something, she answered, drawing a tiny after the will reading. I wanted to know what Dad Richard was truly thinking. So I took a notebook out of her pocket and proceeded. My mother gave me the notebook, which was my father's old journal. After going through some of his belongings that she had put away, year that was full of his reflections on the company, his health, and his family, including his regrets for our he wasn't thrilled with his alienation and his mounting worries about Diana's influence. Brittany whispered that he missed you and was beginning to see through his mother's. I turned the pages. I recognized my father's handwriting and his distinctive blend. Additionally, there were thorough notes regarding Diana's attempts to isolate Richard and her meetings with Lawrence Blackwood. I inquired, does your mother know you have this? And Brittany shook her head, citing pressure from old friends to amend his will. She would be upset, but since it supports what you said, I felt you should have it. Regarding Dad's desire for you to return home and take charge, I examined her face. In search of indications of dishonesty, why display this to me? You're essentially providing me with ammunition, and it's the right thing to do against your mother. She replied plainly, I want to remain in Maplewood because I adore it and don't want to see it destroyed by a mother's machinations or a family feud. Shouting broke out from downstairs before I could reply, rushed down and discovered Tyler and Diana arguing angrily with a stranger who looked much like Diana's voice was sharp. My father, you have no right to be here. The woman saw me on the stairs and her face changed, but Richard never acknowledged you. You must be Maxwell. She introduced herself as Alice Thornton Richard, who was also my half-sister's father. In a week full of lies I had no idea there was. Another bombshell. Alice said, "I don't want to." In a desperate attempt to get money, for years, Richard and I maintained a secret connection, and at my request, I just came to greet my brother and pay my respects. She held out her hand to me. Her cautious yet optimistic gaze reminded me of my father's, so I took it as a sign. Richard Harrison's life seems to have come together, and we have a lot to discuss. Diana made a "Come on, Tyler, I won't stand here," and watched the sparse because of the sound of distaste. Tyler followed her as she raged out, paused, and then stealthily slipped. Alice grinned and left me alone with the sister. I didn't know I had, hesitantly. "This isn't how I imagined our first meeting." "Nothing about this week has gone as imagined," I said with a mocking chuckle. "But if you don't mind, I'd like to know about you and your connection with your father." We relocated to Alice started telling me about her mother's brief relationship with my father before he met my mother in the living room. How her father had accepted her into his life in a respectful manner, and how she had learned of her paternity as an adult's request for privacy. "He was quite proud of you," she added, "and he talked about you constantly." As Alice talked, I felt both sadness and thankfulness for what you were doing in Asia. Even though he missed you tremendously, sweeping over me my sorrow for the years my father had passed away, and my appreciation for what he had discovered methods to preserve his legacy in spite of Diana's meddling. Nonetheless, the future would be difficult given Diane's failed legal action and the rifts in the community Franklin had spoken of. But I was more committed than ever to upholding later that evening when I poured over my father's vision for Maplewood. And Harrison Properties, my phone rang with a text from an unknown number. It was Lawrence Blackwood. "We need to look at the company records in the guest room." I looked at the message, realizing that the fight was far from done. For Maplewood's future and my father's legacy was only getting started. There was a flurry of action after the will reading, and I formally took over Harrison Properties operations, together with Margaret, to evaluate the harm Diana had caused and create a plan for rehabilitation. After months of Diana's erratic leadership, the majority of the staff came together to support me, relieved to have clear leadership once more. As we went over the revised business plan, Margaret informed me that your father would be proud with the management. The steady hand the business requires, but not all board members were happy with my return. Some had sided with in response to Diana's resignation. Lawrence Blackwood started a public relations effort that Suggested believed his development company could better grasp Maplewood's needs than a faraway heir could. Diana herself made a startling revelation after weeks of threatening and posing. Asking for a win, I informed Franklin that Diana doesn't make conciliatory. He cautioned me to be cautious when we met at her lawyer's office. Gestures unless she had a point. So I agreed to meet with her because I was interested in what she would have to contribute that would interest me. Grace insisted on staying in the lobby with me as a moral support system while I confronted Diana and her attorney. Diana appeared flawless as usual, but there was a harshness to her flawless face that hadn't been. She continued without preamble. "I want to propose a settlement before the stress of the past month had taken a toll. In order to prevent expensive legal proceedings and public humiliation," her lawyer, a sardonic Mrs. Harrison, a woman I didn't recognize, put a document on the table between us and offered to withdraw all property transfers and lawsuits against the estate in return for operational authority over the Riverside Development Project, the portfolio's most valuable property. Made me almost laugh aloud. Diana insisted that I work. "But that's not a settlement, that's a heist. Richard and I worked on the project's blueprints for years. It was my father's idea. I corrected her long before you entered the scene, and it wasn't boutiques and opulent condos. Rather, it was reasonably priced housing, public areas, nearby companies, and Diana's facade broke Maplewood needs to change. A little bit because the current method is Richard realized that as he was dying, so I pulled out my phone and asked him, then showing one of Dad's films in which he made it clear that Diana didn't comprehend his actual plan for Diana's cheeks flushed. With rage at the Riverside property, he was sick and perplexed. I pointed out that he was sensible enough to legally give me his most valuable assets and to record the reasons why Diana and her lawyers stormed out as the discussion came to an abrupt stop. Franklin claims that although he promised additional legal action, no lawsuit emerged as the weeks went by. Sources, Diana's lawyers had told her that her stance was illegal, but I had been receiving, unlike Diana's kids. Alice showed no desire in getting to know my half-sister. She taught environmental science at a Colorado university in the family company and was enthusiastic about our discussions on sustainability and conservation, inspired me to include green areas, and Dad would have enjoyed it when Alice mentioned incorporating sustainable design into the Riverside development. When I shared my up-to-date idea for the project, he had always been interested in environmental projects, but Diana dissuaded him from doing so because she thought they were too expensive. Brittany had turned into an unanticipated ally in overcoming the change. She had separated from Diana's My Nations, relocating to a downtown apartment, and providing priceless insights on her mother's business activities, which her mother has been using to liquidate her during one of our frequent coffee dates. She told me about her personal assets, including jewelry and artwork. Designer furniture, I believe. She intends to leave Maplewood. Tyler has stayed antagonistic, but is becoming more. His town pals had started to turn away from him after hearing that he was involved in some of Diana's most. Despite the circulation of dubious business judgments, the true breakthrough occurred during a town council meeting where I displayed my updated plans for the Riverside development, which no longer included Diana's opulent apartments and upscale stores. Swapped out for a mixed-use project that featured a community center and reasonably priced apartments for nearby companies. And broad public access to the shoreline, which is what my father had initially intended. I clarified, a project that would help everyone in Maplewood, not just the wealthy few in Lawrence Blackwood, was presented to the crowded meeting room. Naturally, he came there with his own glitzy appearance and assurances of tax income from his upscale project. But when locals started to inquire about the price of housing and public access, his concept swiftly lost favor, which the Harrison plan maintains while allowing for character development. Grace ejected from the audience about Maplewood Council unanimously approved the Blackwood plan, which turns us into simply another playground for the wealthy. As I departed the meeting, the idea dealt a severe blow to Lawrence and Diana's hopes for Maplewood's future. "You win this round," said Lawrence, his face gloomy but resigned. "I've been in this company much longer than you, Harrison," he said, "so I can wait, or you could adjust as I recommended. If you're prepared to work within the community-focused framework, there is space for your business in my development plan." Lawrence appeared surprised by the offer. "Why would you recommend that, if you're good in spite of everything?" I recognized what you did, and my father used to say that a clever businessman can find a method to succeed by doing good. Although we were unable to come to a consensus that evening, the door had occasionally been opened. Reconciliation can take unexpected turns. The last encounter with Diana didn't take place in a courtroom, but rather in the evening when I went to pick up the remainder of my belongings. I discovered her in the garden of the house that had once been our family's home. She was sitting on the stone bench close to my mother's rose bushes, gazing at my possessions before I moved into my own house. She wasn't angry when she saw me. Even though she was older and smaller than I remembered, I sat next to her, keeping a straight face as she continued, "I'm leaving Maplewood because there's nothing left for me here. Keep a safe distance. Where are you returning to Connecticut? My sister is there, gave me a sidelong glance, and said, "You've won Maxwell, the company the town supports. Are you content with even my daughter's loyalty?" The inquiry wasn't totally sour. Rather, it was genuinely curious. After a minute, I stated that it was about honoring Dad's legacy, not about winning. For a long time, Maplewood Diana's legacy of doing the right thing was silent. She eventually claimed that when he left, she grew more aloof and concentrated on his projects that I believed would strengthen our relationship if I become involved with the company. Suggested that she didn't dispute it, and then you had a taste of it. I'm not sorry for desiring security, Maxwell thought, once in your life when you're left with nothing. You go to whatever lengths to ensure that it doesn't happen again. I considered the complicated woman next to me to be materialistic and manipulative, but also influenced by her personal anxieties and incidents of her father abandoning you financially invest in the house. But don't try to take anything that has nothing to do with it. She responded with startling candor, but she stood up now that it was over. As she straightens her shoulders. I've told my lawyer to drop all challenges to the property and will transfers. In exchange, I anticipate that you will respect the arrangements Dad set for me, and he told her, I never plan to contest those with my children. And she nodded once. Goodbye, Maxwell. A professional end to our connection. I doubt we'll cross paths again, as Diana dot as I left. I had a peculiar mixture of relief and regret rather than triumph. The family I had dreamed for when my father remarried had never come to pass, but new relationships had taken its place. Following morning, I met with the Maplewood community, which had welcomed me home. Together with Alice and Brittany, I glanced around the meeting room as the Harrison Properties team prepared to formally launch the Riverside development project. I sensed my father's presence among the excited faces, especially Brittany, who had just started working in the marketing division. I firmly stated to the crew that my father used to say that property is permanence, meaning that anything we construct here would endure beyond Alice. So let's ensure that Maplewood may take pride in it for many years to come. As the meeting ended the relationship, Grace came up to me smiling and said, Your dad would be really proud, Max. I nodded, feeling relieved for he would, for the first time since coming back to Maplewood, and I believe this is only the beginning. A year upon my return to Maplewood, I stood on the recently built observation deck, which provided a view of the Riverside development. Previously undeveloped terrain was now a thriving development site, where the first buildings were beginning to take shape. A central green area was surrounded by affordable housing units, and the community center and nearby businesses' foundations. It was quite a sight to see the incubator being placed closer to the water. Franklin added. I nodded, remembering how much Richard would have liked this from me at the railing. I wish my father had had a different vision for this land and realized how close it was to becoming something completely different. Franklin merely pointed to a bronze plaque we had and said, He can see it. Richard Harrison Memorial Park, which is situated at the development's entrance, would serve as the focal point of the last year's project to guarantee that my father's contribution to Maplewood will be remembered had been taking over my father's business had a profound impact on Harrison Properties, as well as on me personally. Made me establish roots in a manner I had eschewed for years in order to interact with the community, not only as a developer, but also as the scholarship committee authorized all 15 since they are citizens who have a stake in its future. Alice told me, looking at her tablet, that my half-sister had relocated to Maplewood 6 months ago to assist in the founding of the Richard Harrison Foundation, which offered local residents educational possibilities. I responded that students interested in community planning and sustainable development would be ideal for the internship. Program begins next month. and we have already partnered with 3 institutions. Alice had grown to be a crucial part of my life, helping me to connect the dots between the past and the present. I had never heard any tales about our father's modest environmental work, his unnamed assistance to underprivileged kids, and mentoring of aspiring business owners was something he never desired. Alice acknowledged that he only wished to improve things in that sense. I had steered Harrison Properties in the direction of projects that struck a balance between community good and financial gain. It wasn't always simple. On the business council, Lawrence Blackwood and his supporters regularly fought our more progressive anitas. But unexpectedly, Brittany was the one who, frequently having watched Diana charm and maneuver her way through Maplewood as a child, I was able to help navigate these political waters. Brittany had become well versed in the social dynamics of the area. Lawrence is scheduled to speak against the expansion of affordable housing at the council meeting next week. She cautioned me as we made our way back to the office. He has been secretly lobbying council members. I asked for any recommendations after learning Toive already. Made plans for residents from the first phase to attend because I appreciate her strategic thinking. Brittany grinned and tell their stories. Lawrence is free to disagree with us, but he is unable to do so with families who have secure housing now. Margaret was waiting with a stack of documents at Harrison Properties headquarters because of the development. Among the documents that needed, my signature was the last one that cut off Diana's last ties to the "Have you heard from the company," where she agreed to sell her minority interests in exchange for a lump sum payment. Margaret inquired as I signed the paperwork, and I didn't say anything out loud. But Brittany claims she's remarried, residing in Greenwich, and reportedly serving on the board of an art museum. She is actively reimagining, no longer felt animosity toward Diana since she had behaved in accordance with her role as a philanthropist. Her character, much like my father, had finally done what was right by making sure his legacy would be preserved. Richard Harrison was a more complicated person than I had realized from watching his films, reading his journals, and hearing other people's stories. More strategic, foresighted, and understanding of human frailties than the father I believed I knew. "You've got," Margaret reminded me as I returned the signed papers. "Dinner with Grace at 7, and don't forget the by tomorrow. The historical group expects an answer about the ancient mill land." Thanked her and went to my office, which I had renovated from my father's old office. The Monte Cristo picture, which hung in its original location, was restored to something like its original condition with my personal embellishments, even if the concealed key was long since lost. Pictures still adorn the shelves, not only of my father and me, but now of Alice, Brittany, Grace, and other significant simple framed message that had been among my father's personal belongings was the most significant addition to the people in my life. Property is permanent, but people's legacy is what I've made peace with. With Tyler as well, in a way. And after months of animosity, he had finally come up to me. He had a business idea to open a posh restaurant in one of the downtown Harrison Properties buildings. I had agreed to give advantageous lease conditions despite Margaret's advice, and Margaret grimly foresaw that he would lack a work ethic. But surprisingly, Tyler had found his love in the culinary arts, something Diana seemed to have in his restaurant. Had become a success. Constantly demoralized as being beneath their social standing. But even though we would never be close, we had achieved a civil realizing that I made a last call to inquire about the memorial's condition as the sun started to drop over the river. One of my first actions after taking over the business was to create a scholarship named after my mother. First grantees graduate next, and the fund supports young women pursuing professions in architecture, my mother's unrealized aspiration. The program supervisor told me in the spring that they are already inquiring about Harrison internship opportunities. Following the call, I paused to consider how far I had come from that soggy day in Singapore when, after learning of my father's passing, I came home to Maplewood feeling devastated and determined to assert what was somewhere along the line. That objective evolved into something bigger, respecting not only my inheritance, but the accompanying responsibilities, the conflict at the will, and my dramatic moment of it seems like a lifetime ago when the property deeds were placed on the tabled up and fulfilling indeed. But the true fulfillment came from what transpired after the community was strengthened. Connections were restored, and the legacy was secured with Grace Dot was at our favorite restaurant, waiting for me and her. Face brightened as I walked in. Our friendship had grown stronger. She had been my rock during the turbulent transition over the past year, gradually developing into something more my manual for the Maplewood that had developed while I was away, and ultimately my business and life partner as we sat at our table. I informed her that the Riverside lookout was breathtaking. After supper, she proposed that I watch the sunset from up there, and I nodded. The ring I bought last week was burning a hole in my pocket while I waited for the event, and I was already planned to bring champagne. As we savored our lunch, I couldn't help but reflect on the adventure. The inheritance I had battled for, which had brought me here, had proven to be so much more than property deeds and business assets. It was an opportunity to make peace with my past and create new relationships to establish something significant on the basis of the real estate deeds. One possessed, which my father had produced, presented in a dramatic manner at the will reading, had been significant. In fact, they had granted me legal authority over my father's legacy, but what I really inherited was the values and vision Dad had given me, the values of accountability and community that had influenced my growth strategy, even during our Deanna, who had been separated for years, had never realized that she had viewed the properties as resources to leverage the company, as Ash had overlooked the underlying meaning that had motivated my father throughout his life as a source of riches and prestige. After dinner, Grace and I strolled hand in hand along the riverbank, and as the twilight gathered, I experienced a deep appreciation for my father's vision in providing me with a second opportunity to fit in at Maplewood, for that chance to create something that will live longer than I do. What do you think of Grace asking after seeing Maya said, "What we leave behind, how we're remembered?" In a reflective tone, gripping my palm, I thought, "Your dad would be proud of what you've done here and what you're still doing." I nodded. My father was complicated, flawed, yet ultimately loving. I have learned more about him in death than I occasionally had in life, had aired, as we all did, that ultimately he had done his best to safeguard what was most important as we arrived at the With. A view of the project that would shape Maplewood's future from the observation deck, I realized it was time. The ring box felt heavy in my pocket, but my heart felt light, and I was prepared for whatever came next. Was intended to be establishing my own legacy while continuing my father's. What about, have there ever been instances where you had to defend your rights against those who attempted to exploit you? Having to decide between justice and reconciliation at some point? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Stories in the comments section below. And if you liked this dramatization of an inheritance, don't forget to like this video. Family redemption, and sign up for more real-life tales that will inspire you to consider legacy, families, and what really matters in life. Therefore, thank you for viewing, and keeping in mind that sometimes the most important inheritance is the ideals and vision that have been passed down through the centuries, not material possessions or money